This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
And you thought communism was as dead as Marx, Lenin, and Castro. Well, meet Matt Holten, who's calling for a different form of communism to save economies that now depend on capitalism. Mr. Holten says traditional capitalism thwarts the Earth's capacity to maintain life and undermines the basic human needs for peace and prosperity. His Moneyless Society movement was started out of a desire to better the world for future generations, he says. In this edition of Biz News Interviews, Matt Holten explains his theories. Matt, you have written a book talking about what you would like to see as a moneyless society. But Matt, how do you pay your electric bills? How do you keep the air conditioning going?
Well, in the society that we're talking about, it would be something that is a long transitionary period. So essentially, we wouldn't really be doing this right away. There would be an interim period where we would utilize more systems and structures that we have available to us now. In particular, in my book, I talk about utilizing cooperatives to where people equally own and manage resources instead of it being more of like a hierarchical model where there's, basically a dictatorship in business where there's one person at the top who controls everything. We really advocate utilizing cooperative structures to where that ownership and that management would be more equally more of a horizontal sort of thing to where everybody who's involved has more of a say. They also have more ownership in those resources and things like that. So those are the kind of transitional models that we advocate using to get to a moneyless society, which would probably take at least a couple of decades, maybe even longer, just kind of depending on, a host of, factors and everything going on.
Money
But
has
that's a great
been,
question. Go ahead. Sorry, what?
well, money's been part of the human existence since, I guess, forever, for all practical purposes. How are you hoping to change tens of thousands of years of economies in a couple of decades?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So trade as we know it has been around for a very, very long time, but for the majority of human history, it hasn't really existed in the sense that we know it today, where everything is essentially like a commodity and you have to trade your time and labor and energy and therefore money to acquire necessities. It was really anything before about 6 or 8 thousand years ago. Trade was really kind of more of a gifting thing to where people or tribes and communities were essentially gifting one another with things that they could show their appreciation for and develop relationships and things like that. It was kind of more of an honor based system or a gifting based system, things like that. Really, the history of kind of money as we know it today really kind of began around in Mesopotamia, where they used to deposit grain in these granaries, and in exchange for depositing that grain, farmers would receive tokens. And while those tokens weren't really traded very often, they did constitute kind of the basis for debt and money as we know it today. And so that actually only happened about like 6 to 8 thousand years ago. Now, the real problem with money as it is right now is the profit incentive that we have right now is just kind of creating this feedback loop where it incentivizes people to essentially exploit other people as well as nature and all of our resources. And there's a direct conflict of interest there because the more we exploit other people and our resources and everything, the more we overdo that. And essentially now we're getting into the phase of overusing those resources and over exploiting people to where it's creating vast amounts of inequality as well as resource overshoot. And if we can kind of curtail that profit incentive, even at least to a degree, by implementing more of these cooperative structures to where it's not one person that's incentivized to just dramatically, exploit and overuse resources and things like that, then we hope that can kind of be more of a fundamental paradigm shift to where people can start cooperating with each other more to essentially provide abundance for everybody. And we really want to eliminate the need for trade. We want to eliminate the need for money essentially because ultimately we want to create systems and structures that provide abundance for free. right? We want to be able to say have a community garden that just provides everybody with food, and even go so far as to have that be partially or mostly automated, right? To where robots and technology could grow a good portion of the food. That's very realistic to do these days. And that way we could just distribute that food to whoever needs it in the community. And these models and systems are very realistic to implement, but they just haven't really been built yet in our modern society. And instead, we're kind of trapped in this system where we have to go to the grocery store and buy food and things like that. But if we consciously start creating these systems and structures in our own lives and our communities, then I think a lot of people see that they can work. And with some tweaking and trial and error and things like that, we'll probably find ways to provide ourselves with an abundance of food, water, clothing, even go so far as eventually things like housing, maybe healthcare, education in the long term, things like that. So it's kind of putting those pieces together one at a time systemically, and kind of really thinking about how we're going to do it, how a transition could take place. We don't have all the answers, we don't have it all mapped out from start to finish, but we have a general idea of how this could work. And it's going to take a lot of experimenting, a lot of trial and error, a lot of finding out what works in different places and different ways for different people and their cultures and ideas. And there's so much to take into account there. It's difficult just to say, well, if you do this, it's going to work. It's kind of like, well, we have those systems kind of generally outlined, but getting there is going to be quite, a transitional process, essentially.
In addition to having to deal with vested interests who have deep pockets, you also might have to deal with reality. Where on earth would you set this up? We no longer have a frontier where you could gather like-minded people, a couple of dozen of them, into a community and try to be self-sufficient like that. We're too interconnected, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, let me give you a little bit of my history too, because a lot of people kind of ask me like how this would work and the transition. So, initially, when I began my interest in all of this, it was because I kind of had a tumultuous childhood. My mother actually became relatively schizophrenic because she had a car accident, and she got addicted to pain pills and kind of went mentally ill essentially. And then she ended up committing suicide when I was a teenager. And she really struggled to get the help that she needed through the medical system and everything, and it basically kind of failed her miserably. And so she committed suicide when I was 15 years old, and I subsequently ran away from home, and I dropped out of school, and I also, became addicted to drugs and alcohol, and I had a really hard time getting the help that I needed in a lot of different ways too. And I just kind of wanted to check out of society. I actually really did want to find a place to live that was like an eco village or eco community or something like that, and just say, bye, I don't really want to have much to do with this society anymore. But I actually had a daughter at a young age too, and so that kind of prevented me from doing that because I wanted to be a part of her life, and I was also forced to pay child support as well. So I was really kind of forced to go out and get a job. But I also struggled doing that. I struggled to get, a foothold in society without a college education. I bounced around. I've had over 100 different jobs. I've waited tables 7 different times. I've delivered pizza for 8 different restaurants. I've been a poker dealer. I've sold insurance. I've sold real estate. I've done a lot of different things. And so the initial thing that I really wanted to do was start a community somewhere, because that's kind of wasn't in existence yet for these principles. Initially, what got me turned on to the idea was I saw a movie called Zeitgeist Addendum, and this movie Zeitgeist Addendum pretty much outlines kind of a lot of the flaws within the capitalist system, like the profit incentive, and it also talks about this model called the Venus Project that's based in Florida, actually, in Venus, Florida, hence the name the Venus Project. But their model is called a resource-based economy, where essentially the economy is based on resources itself, as opposed to a monetary system. And I was really hoping that there would be some sort of community at the Venus Project. They have 21 acres in Florida there. But there wasn't really an actual community of people coming together to build these systems and structures in real life. And so that's what I really wanted to do and find. And I really couldn't find anything that was out there in existence that was really focused on building these systems and structures and, kind of heading that direction one step at a time. And so that's a great question, though. There actually are a couple communities in existence that are kind of more utilizing these models. There's a town in Spain called Marinaleda that is a 2,500 person agricultural cooperative, and they've been running these sorts of principles for the last 30 years. Although they don't really use a lot of technology and automation. It's kind of more just like in a farming community essentially, but they distribute resources just based on need. If you need something, you get it, right? And there's no mortgages, there's no police force in that community. They save hundreds of thousands of dollars by not having a police force, because essentially there's no need for theft and crime anymore at that point, because the people are actually getting what they need. Another model that's really working pretty well is the Mondragon Cooperative. They're the largest cooperative in the world. They're also based in the Basque region in Spain, northern Spain there. They have over 80,000 employees, 100 different companies that are under their subsidiary. They have a credit union. They have their own grocery store chain called Eroski. They also have, they're one of the leading manufacturers in solar module technology as well. So, I mean, these guys are a powerhouse. They have their own university as well in their town in Spain there. And so these models are actually working really well. In like the 08 and 09 crisis, they managed that crisis wonderfully too. All they did was they shifted people around from one position to another instead of laying people off, within their framework of businesses. And if people needed to have pay cuts, they took those pay cuts voluntarily across the board with everybody, instead of laying off the some workers and then other workers keeping their job. So we do have proof that these models work, at least in the fragmented conditions that they exist within our society. And if we could combine that with a little bit more technology, and scale up, using some of these kind of new governance models and things like that, then there's a strong chance that Spain would be an excellent region to start, because they actually do have a couple of models in existence that are similar to this as well. There's other places in South America. I think there's one kind of research community down in Peru that's trying to start these things. They're kind of out in the wilderness a little bit, but they are real, trying to implement these sorts of structures and everything. Doing it within the United States might be a bit of a stretch, because there's a lot of pushback here, and you never know when somebody's going to show up on your doorstep that just doesn't like your idea and they want to, halt it or burn it down for some reason. Who knows? But we honestly do want to try to start developing cooperatives in the United States as well. And it might not necessarily look like it does, in Marinaleda or Mondragon at this point, but just kind of implementing these democratically equal ownership models, and building on those, I think, is a really good start. Like if we could build a community where people are actually, own it in a cooperative model to where everybody has equal ownership in that model, and then start a business within that community to where people actually have more equal ownership in those business models. That's a very realistic thing to do. And it can operate within the greater capitalist society as well. You just kind of got to make sure that you put those systems and structures in place to where people will utilize them. It's like the phrase, if you build it, they will come, right? So we need to build
that's baseball, I think.
right? But it works. Like one thing we really kind of pushes the idea of operant conditioning, right? And we're conditioned in our society right now to behave in certain ways because of the profit incentive, because of that incentive exists for us to go out and exploit people and exploit resources and use those for our own benefit at the exclusion of everyone else. But if we put more systems and structures in place to where that incentivize us to cooperate, and we get those, agreements, essentially like business structures in place, then we start utilizing those, and I will probably find that those work really well in a lot of situations. And cooperatives are already pretty common
Matt,
too.
let me suggest to you that perhaps we have reached too much technology to make that work. It's one thing perhaps to have farmers and a farming community do this, but if you're talking on a computer and I'm talking on a computer with a microphone made in Australia here, how on earth would we assemble literally assemble all of that stuff to make stuff
Sure.
work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so for more complicated things like computers or vehicles or just kind of larger scale complex items that take a large amount of skill, proficiency, resources, systems to put in place, those things would likely be more distributed on a, or I mean, the manufacturing of those things would be distributed more on a regional basis, essentially. So as opposed to like every town, say, being able to build their own car or their own computer or something like that. What you would have is maybe, say, for a region like, a larger city or maybe Southern California, you'd have several larger manufacturing hubs that would, not necessarily locally, but at least somewhat locally be able to manufacture those items and then distribute them to people in that region. Another thing is looking at access instead of ownership models. Like, say, for a vehicle, for instance, society is most likely going to be transitioning from a vehicle ownership model into a vehicle access model within the coming decades, regardless of capitalism. And this is because of automated driving technology. And so, what that will do is it will enable a car to come pick you up and drop you off and then leave and go on to its next destination without any human actually having to drive that car. And what that'll do is it eliminate any person having to own a vehicle in order to use a vehicle, right? And so that's very good for resource use because most of us own a car right now, yet it sits in our driveway for 20 plus hours a day being unused, right? And so if we can have, let's say, one car that serves 10 people instead of 10 cars serving 10 people, then that dramatically cuts down the resource use that is needed to supply those people with the transportation that they need. Same thing with maybe like larger things too. Like if you need the use of a computer, if there's a computer hub within your community where you can just go and have access to a computer anytime you want, and there's enough there to meet the demand, then you don't necessarily have to have a computer right there on your desk at all times. Although it might be nice to have that as well. And computers are being so mass produced these days that it's probably not much of a stretch to accomplish something like that anyway. But we kind of like base it more of an you don't have to own everything in order to have access and to be able to use it and to be able to gain the benefit from using those things. And not only that, we want to eliminate unnecessary labor as well. So let's say in this type of society, instead of you having to commute 45 minutes to a job, right, just to make money, to pay the electric bill, to pay for food, to pay for all this, none of that exists anymore. You don't have to commute for 45 minutes because you don't have an electric bill to pay, right? You don't have to go buy food at the grocery store, right? Your electricity is being provided by renewable energy in your community, right? And everybody kind of pitches in to keep those systems going locally. And you don't have to commute 45 minutes to make money in order to make that happen. Same thing with food. You just kind of pitch in to keep these systems going locally. If there's an automated community garden, that serves, several communities or something like that, then a lot of people would likely pitch in to keep that garden going and to keep it functioning properly because we have the benefit of eating from that garden, right? And that's a pretty strong incentive for people to actually keep things going like that. And you'll find when you take the money out of the situation, a lot of time the incentive still exists for these things. Yet a lot of the labor is eliminated. And with a lot of that labor being eliminated because you don't have all this unnecessary busy work, you can do much more with a lot fewer resources. Like we were saying, where you can do a lot more with one car serving multiple people, and those resources go much further at that point, and so it's those type of
It would certainly improve the highway conditions in virtually every state, but we
yeah.
would probably miss all those crazy drivers. They're all worse than we are, of course. Uh,
Miss the headaches and the stress, right?
yes. Matt, what's been the reaction to your book?
I get a lot of mixed reactions. It's kind of funny because a lot of people assume that when I say a moneyless society, that we're talking about going back to barter. They automatically assume that, oh, well, okay, we would be bartering things. Then I would, produce my rice and I would trade that with my neighbors for eggs or something like that. And I'm like, No, it's really not the case. And it's kind of funny too, because most societies in the past were never based on barter. If there was any bartering to be done, it was like we were saying, it's more of a gift, like, here, you need this, neighbor, no problem, you can have it. If I need something down the road, I'll ask you for it too, and hopefully you'll have it. You'll give that to me. It's just kind of like this, honor-based gifting system. And barter, as a lot of us come to know the term today, never really was a basis for much of any society in the past. So it's a very common misconception. People are like, oh, we're just going to go back to a bartering society. No, that's actually not the case. What we're talking about is a society, I like to call it systemic reciprocity as opposed to transactional reciprocity. So transactional reciprocity would be a trade system, right? It's a transaction. Everything's a transaction, and that's kind of the society we live in right now, where if I want water, I have to pay for that water. I have to pay for that electricity. I have to pay for my food. I have to pay for my car, my transportation, or so on and so forth. And everything is based on a transaction. And that's how we reciprocate. It's this trade-based transactional reciprocation. So the systems we're talking about, I like to call it systemic reciprocity, where the entire system itself takes care of everybody and gives everybody what they need. And everybody, when they can, voluntarily puts into that system. So it's kind of this contribution based system, but it's a voluntarily contribution based system. There's nothing saying you have to work here, you have to work this amount of hours, you have to work in this particular field or a job or something like that. People get to contribute how they want, when they want, for however long they want, in whatever shapes and forms. And that really gives people their autonomy, to freely contribute where they see fit, from both themselves, as they can, and where the community needs it, sort of view. And I think people, a lot of the time, they respond really positively to that, because they're thinking, oh, I could do what I want to do. I can work the ways that I want to work and contribute the ways that I really want to contribute, and the ways that I'm good at, and the ways that I enjoy, and things like that. And if you want to take a vacation, that's fine. You don't have to, because there's plenty of other people around. We've reduced the workload to a significant degree to where people don't have to work 40 hours a week. A work week, if you want to even call it that, might just be something like 3 days for 4 or 5 hours a day. If you maybe say sign up to a position where you have some sort of obligation or something like that. But there's lots of systems and structures, like we said, we could kind of experiment with it. But that's kind of the whole idea, is you put into this entire system when and where you choose, how you choose, on a voluntary, autonomous basis, and then that entire system essentially takes care of everybody in return.
Matt, what is your next step?
Well, the next step is really, I mean, what we do is we try to create awareness first and foremost that these things are even a possibility, because a lot of what we're talking about just, it's not even in the window of discourse right now. People talk about improving, the capitalist and the monetary and the trade-based systems. How can we fight climate change and make profit at the same time? And that's kind of like the mindset that most people are in society. Well, what's in it for, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to put a roof over my head and pay for food and electricity and all this stuff? And like, well, what if we just made that model obsolete altogether? What if we find a way that works better than that, and it isn't based on trade or based on people working whatever it is 40 hours a week, and it's not based on the monetary system and interest and debt and all this other stuff. What if we can just do away with that in the long term and find these better systems? And so that's essentially, we want to create awareness and talk about, like we're doing right now, have conversations that these things are actually possible, that there are ways to implement this in society. And then we want to start doing that. So we actually do want to start creating cooperatives. We want to start gathering people who are interested in creating, these business structures and these communities and these types of ownership and governance. We want to start gathering them together and actually start forming these things. So that's really the next step. And that could be here in the United States, that could be abroad. And it can take shape in a variety of ways. Cooperatives can come about, for practically any form of business model. There's lots and lots of different types of cooperatives. Worker cooperatives in particular are the kinds that we see as being the most beneficial, because worker cooperatives are the type where workers actually own part of the business. There's other types of cooperatives that are called cooperatives, but they also still follow more of the traditional employee owner, employee employer model, essentially, to where the employee doesn't have any ownership and they're just kind of taking orders. Um, like producer cooperatives kind of still employ that model a lot. Producer cooperatives are pretty common in the agricultural industry, like Land O'Lakes, Ocean Spray. Those are big producer cooperatives where essentially a bunch of producers come together and leverage their producing power, in the marketplace, so they can get better, contracts and deals and things like that. Credit unions are a form of cooperative, like mutual insurance companies are also types of cooperatives, things like that. So consumer co-ops, you've probably been to a consumer co-op in the form of a little grocery store at one point. A lot of people have seen those around. But worker cooperatives in particular are the ones where we really want to start, to where we're implementing that worker ownership model, to where the workers actually do own part of the business and they actually have a say in that business, and they derive the benefits from the profit of that business as well. And so those are the next steps really for us, or to kind of start creating these worker owned models, as well as just kind of like mutual aid networks in general, where people have agreements that they're going to help other people, in certain situations or for certain things. Whatever we can do to kind of get the trade-based model out and this cooperative model in, sharing, cooperation, things like that, and start shifting people over into that mindset. Those are the next steps that we're really trying to, look for and take in any way that we can, essentially.
Now, where can our listeners and viewers get more information? I suspect you might have a website.
We do. It's called moneylesssociety.com. That's MONEYLESS, like less money, except money less. And then the word society, SOCIETY, moneylesssociety.com. You can also find the book, which is by the same name, Moneyless Society. Subtitle is The Next Economic Evolution. And that should be for sale on most of the major platforms, such as Barnes and Noble or Amazon. That really details everything that we're talking about in pretty good detail. Most of the systems and everything are laid out. So if anybody really wants to get a good, clear, whole picture on what our plans are, what our organization is doing, kind of the principles and systems that we advocate using, as well as just kind of like the flaws that are inherent to the capitalist system, as far as inequality and it just not really being sustainable, especially for the reasons like climate change, resource overshoot, and things like that. All of that's detailed in the book. So if anybody's interested in taking a good dive into it, I highly recommend reading the book, Moneyless Society. Just Google it. There shouldn't be any problem to find that. But you can also look us up on our social media as well. We have a big following on Facebook. It's over 250,000 people following us on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We have our podcast on YouTube as well, where we talk about all these subjects. And our presence is it's steadily growing too. So it's exciting. It's exciting to see people interested, and more people kind of coming on board and volunteering with the organization, and really taking it to these next steps. Yeah. So if anybody's interested in volunteering too, go to our website. We have a form there, and just fill out that form, and we'll get back with you.
You've been watching the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.